And can everyone hear me? I want to make sure. All right, hopefully so. Julie, thank you so much. Really excited for the work that the Drake Group is doing, and in particular, Julie, for the work that you're doing. You traveling all around the country, so really appreciate you. And I appreciate Pat, Bruce, Aaron, and Abigail. I am going to try and talk as little as possible, but ask a lot of questions. And I think I really just want to set the stage in terms of sharing that. I think that, in my opinion, mental health in college sports might be the fifth most important issue that we're facing in college sports. If we look at NIL, if we look at conference realignment, if we look at the dollars, of course, are that important, and whatever else you want to throw in there. Although we have changed the discourse with regard to mental health, it's still not up there in terms of some of our major priorities. That's my opinion, not the opinion of the Drake Group. And so today I wanted to bring together this esteemed panel of individuals really to talk about something that I think is important when we talk about college sports, and that's money, the mix between money and mental health. So today we really want to talk about some of those direct and indirect costs, but we want to talk about them through our lens, whatever our interests might be, whether it's coaching, whether it's actually leading a mental health unit, whether it's leading a sports and performance and overall student athlete well-being unit, or if it's as an academic. What do we think about when we think about college sports? So the first thing that I would like to do is if each of our panelists could give their brief introduction and then also maybe talk about what they want to talk about today. So I'm going to go ahead and, of course, pass it off to Abigail because it's always ladies first.
Well, thank you, Emmett. And hopefully all that are joining us today are logged in so that you can learn a little bit about what we do and how we've managed this in this different spaces. I'm at the University of Michigan. I'm the former director of mental health and high performance services, as well as the former chief diversity officer and an associate athletic director. I made the transition out of collegiate sport, being an embedded clinic in January of this year, to return to my role in academia full time, and have done a lot of work in the pro space with a rookie transition program that I'll talk a little bit about today, really supporting mental health and wellness during that transition phase for professional athletes. Again, glad to be here today and looking forward to contribute to the conversation.
Don't everybody go at once.
I'll call him Pat.
I'll go. Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Pat Ivey. I'm the Associate Athletics Director for Health and Performance at the University of Louisville, former collegiate and professional athlete, and college strength and conditioning coach for over a period of probably 2 decades. Wanted to get into administration and really emphasize the health and performance, safety, wellness for student athletes. And mental health was a huge initiative that we took on at the University of Louisville. And I can talk more about that with our partnership with U of L Health, which is our hospital. Without them, we wouldn't be able to get it done. So excited to be here.
I'll step up. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bruce Smith. I am Director of Empowerment Strategies at Academic Consulting and Empowerment Strategies, ACES Group. ACES Group is a consulting firm that works closely with athletes, families, parents, coaches, school districts, academic and athletic departments on providing support, the wide variety of support necessary for athletes to be successful and empowered, both athletes and students. I'm also a member of the Drake Group Education Fund Board of Directors and work closely with my Drake Group colleagues on these webinars. And I'm looking forward to finding ways to connect things that we've talked about in prior webinars around exploitation of athletes, especially racial exploitation, support for college coaches and educators, and how we can bring a better sense of self to all of our college athletes.
Everybody, I'm Aaron Miller, also a member of the Drake Group Board of Directors and I'm a leadership coach. I run my own company called Amplify Coaching and Consulting. And I'm also an educator. I teach at 3 universities here in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I host a podcast called The Power of Sports. And I've written extensively about the cultural and educational aspects of sports in both Japan and the United States. And in the course of doing research on my latest book about big-time women's college basketball, I came across the ideas that college athletes are professionals, but who are not necessarily treated as such by institutions. And so I'm really grateful for the opportunity to be here and talk about the contexts and problems that create these mental health issues in college sports.
Yeah, thanks to everyone for that introduction. And I am going to ask if Rebecca, if you might be able to allow me to share the screen. I wanted to go ahead and share some information. The wonders of technology. This is just so awesome. I'm so glad we didn't have all of this when I was in school. I had to go to class, and that might have been a problem. I always tell that story. I only went to class when it rained. I hope y'all can see this. Again, I had to apologize to my colleagues because this is actually a working paper, and I wasn't able to do the pretty PowerPoints. So just to add a little context here, those of you who are familiar with the recent Senate hearing regarding a host of student athlete issues, but primarily NIL. And Senator John Kennedy, Republican from Louisiana, pushed back on some of the panic rhetoric about the state of college sports by saying, I'd be real careful about inviting Congress into micromanaging your business. And I think that speaks to Aaron's comments and his perspective now on college sports. Student athletes as professionals. Really quickly, because I don't want to talk too much about sort of mental health disorders, although it's important, but really want to talk about it in the context of the cost of mental health in college sports. 33% of injured athletes experience depressive symptoms and depression. 10% approximately of college athletes seek help. 33% of college athletes quit sports because of mental health issues, which also comes at a cost. Close to 50% transfer because of mental health. And we know now that with the transfer portal, there are also direct and indirect costs. In 2018, the economic cost of treating depression was $236 billion annually and has been steadily increasing since 2010. People with bipolar disorders tend to have higher rates of comorbid medical and comorbid medical issues such as hypertension and psychiatric issues such as substance use disorder or anxiety, which contribute to higher utilization of general medical services compared to the general population. 6.8 people are affected by generalized anxiety disorder, but only 43% seek treatment due to cost. Name brands, anxiety medication, for example, Zoloft, cost up to $358 a month, and other medications cost up to $470 per month. And so just to set the stage, and I'm only going to share one of the mental health disorders, but I, along with some of our graduate students, put together some estimated costs around mental health in college sports. And of course, some of the assumptions that we have is that greater mental health awareness and literacy will increase the percentage of athletes who seek care. Athletic departments, conferences, and governing bodies will incur greater mental health expenditures. The types of mental health expenditures need to expand to meet athlete needs. And I already feel myself talking so much, so I'm going to go through something that we did for depression. Depending on the study that you look at, 17 to 30% of student athletes experience a depressive episode or some form of depression. 8% of males and 17% of female student athletes felt so depressed it was difficult to compete. And other studies on the prevalence of depression vary between, again, 15 and 23%. So if we use an N of 500,000 NCAA student athletes, and we say that 17 to 30% experience some form of depression, then in general, we're talking about in somewhere between, give or take, 85,000 and 150,000 student athletes. And so we computed the costs based on things like medication, inpatient stay, and others. But if we looked at an overall cost that could come at a cost at anywhere between 816 million and 1.6 billion dollars to treat NCAA athletes who experience depression for 1 year. And some of the things that we think about, and Abigail and Pat can certainly speak to this, is we have to expand beyond clinicians. Like, everyone believes if we get a clinician, then we're good to go. But it's one clinician for 200 athletes or one clinician for 300 athletes. But then we also don't think about some of the other costs that either athletic departments, athletes, or parents on their insurance have to incur. For example, when we talk about depression, their medications, their inpatient stays. And then you can start to come up with an average cost to treat depression. And we didn't consider a lot of the things. Nonetheless, we said if we did have a sample of, say, 300 athletes and 22% of those athletes experience depression, we're talking about 60 or so student athletes. Let's say 10% of them seek help, which means that that's about 6 student athletes. So to treat those athletes for 1 year could cost about $57,000. And that's not considering some of the unaccounted costs. For example, the cost of therapy, lost tuition, say they have to go to summer school, or even if we could put a financial cost on lost games. So that's the way that I was thinking about sort of the cost of mental health in college sports. And I would love for Pat and Abigail, if they could, to kick us off in terms of just saying, as managers of those units, do any of those things sort of resonate for you? Or what are some of your major budget expenditures when you think about mental health?
Sure, I can start. I think coming from a school like the University of Michigan, who has a really long-standing commitment to mental health and wellness within sport. So we have an embedded clinic. We've had an embedded provider since the 80s. And we've continued to grow that over time to the point where we've gotten up to 8 providers, which has included our interns, our MSW interns. But I think, it's really interesting, Emma, you brought up an important fact here, right? By adding a clinician, that doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to be able to be responsive to everyone's mental health and wellness needs, especially when we're looking at things across the spectrum. There were points in my tenure at Michigan that my budget was $750,000, right? So one of the largest, if not the largest, operating budgets for mental health and wellness in collegiate sport. And while it felt like we definitely had enough providers, there were a multitude of other things that we were investing in. So when we looked at mental health and wellness campaigns, when we were looking things on more the prevention side, so we can bring in a guest speaker that's going to give advice and reflect and really connect with our athletes. But unless we're doing something to follow that, whether it be skill building groups or opportunities for further discussion, we've missed the mark. And so I think we've got to get really creative with opportunities beyond the individual counseling to really support our student athletes across the country.
Can I ask a question real quick? I know I'm not the facilitator here, but I think that's really interesting stuff that you're talking about, Abigail. And I guess I have a couple of questions. One is, yes, that's a lot of $750,000. That's a lot. It's a pretty big budget. And my first question is, was that enough? And my second question is, and I think I know the answer to this question as well. It seems like your unit is directly connected to athletes. I wonder if there's something similar to connect with coaches and other administrators around their mental health, or to teach them about supporting athlete mental health.
So that was actually the responsibility of our athletic counseling staff with our sport administration team. We have an Athletes Connected program that's been rolled out. It was supported by the NCAA in 2014 and has continued to grow. It's really the education and outreach side of the wellness work that we do at Michigan. So we developed during the pandemic a group called Coaches Connected that emphasized on how do we support and train coaches to better understand what does it mean to work with athletes of today, right? I'm sure a lot of us were former athletes as well, and we were coached very differently. The understanding and responsiveness to mental health has changed significantly over the past few decades. And so I think it's important to invest in that space, not directly providing care for our coaches at Michigan, but ultimately providing resources and support to better support the student athletes has been a big piece for us. So yeah, Bruce, I think you have to do everything in between. The prevention work isn't just for our athletes, it's also for our coaches and all those that are in contact with our coaches. Leadership development, careers, you know, the list can go on and on.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point to bring up. To me, in my work with athletes, with ACES Group, and in the work I used to do when I was an academic support professional at a couple different schools that, and what is now what is currently the Pac-12 and won't be for very much longer. But a lot of the mental health issues that I saw in my students stemmed from their interactions with their coaches, right? And I think Aaron can attest to that as well from his work with another school in what would formerly be the Pac-12. And I think there's a lot of opportunity to talk about not just, and I think that where the conversation is going right now around, it's not just about clinicians, right? I think there's a lot of opportunity to talk about how we can better educate those folks who have some contact with athletes about mental health awareness. I think that was one of the things, Emmett, that was on your initial list of topics. And I think that educating people around the athletes about mental health awareness is a really big opportunity for us as well.
Yeah, definitely. That was one of the questions actually, Bruce, and you asked it. You know, our athletic department's spending enough. And again, because I wanted to see if Pat wanted to chime in and or Aaron wanted to chime in. I think that's what's important here is like those things that Abigail was talking.
I think we lost Emmett.
You know, the groups, the follow-up, that stuff costs money. And like, we don't want mental health providers to be like coaches or like, no, like athletic department staff where we're tasking them with a million different things. Like, because they have to be fresh. They're doing human engineering. So now we're talking about things like you got clinicians, but you need case managers. You need to hire case managers or you need interns. But we can't lose sight of the fact that those things cost money. Aaron or Pat, did y'all want to chime in on that?
Yeah, I'll jump in. You know, prior to July 1st, 2022, we had one mental health person and one mental health person and a psychiatrist. And that was all provided by one of our hospital systems in the area. And we were at the point where we were able to renegotiate our contract for our student services, our medical services, and we included mental health in with the services that we wanted provided, whether it was orthopedic or just general family physician work. But we included mental health in with that. And so the University U of L Health stepped up and they provided that for us. So now we currently have 5 mental health professionals, which is outstanding. It's still not enough, but we also have 4 mental performance professionals that work hand in hand with our mental health team. And then there's another position along with the psychiatrist. Then there's one other professor position that we collaborated with the Department of Education on campus, and we created a position called Applied Behavioral Health Sports Performance Professor. And that person has 25% of their time is dedicated to mental performance, but they're also the pipeline for students, whether it's exercise science, mental health, nutrition. They're the pipeline that are creating opportunities for students, undergrad and graduate, to work in the athletics department. And all of that for us, we looked at it, we said we wanted 4 tiers. That's tier 1. Tier 2 is campus and community. So how do we engage the campus and community? So we just started a parent education program for mental health. And that program was started by our Kent School of Social Work right on campus. And our parents so far are loving that program. It's been very helpful. They because the athletes, they don't get to college campuses and all of a sudden they have mental health issues. Like these things happen sometimes long before they got to our campus. So their parents are involved. Tier 3, we involve our industry partners. So whether it's technology, we're working with a company called Optimized Minds. It's a platform for mental performance, so we can actually get information and be able to scale what we're doing, not just to our athletes, but to athletes in the community as well. So our hospital system is working with 14 different high schools. They are investing in us, but they want us to help them to invest in the community. So it's a really good partnership. And then tier 4 is Cards All In. That's our student athlete group. It's a registered student organization. And what we want to be able to do, we've got t-shirts and logos for them. They run their own organization. And our mental health and mental performance staff, they serve as advisors for that group. We want our athletes to be empowered to be able to have some control of what's going on. So that's been going really well. And it's grown really fast in just a short period of time. But I think when we can look outside of the athletics department and look at who else may have some converging interest in what we're doing, and we approach things like maybe from a comprehensive and integrated standpoint, and get out of our silos that we sometimes live in, then we may have the opportunity to go from being over capacity to under capacity.
Yeah, and I definitely want to bring Aaron in because he's been so patient. But you know, I think the thing for today for me is sort of Deion Sanders. It must be the money. Now, all I'm thinking about now is the money, because Pat, when you added up those 5 non-professionals, and I'm thinking salaries, I'm already thinking about, you know, you probably already over 600, 700,000, but I don't know your business like that. But also I think Pat presents something different, because even when we're trying to go out in the community, that costs money, like t-shirts and affinity groups, that costs money. And the last thing that I want to mention is that we also talk about in-kind costs. Like Abigail, those interns, that's in-kind costs. And that's a pretty significant in-kind cost, or the work by the Kent School of Social Work at Louisville. So I appreciate that, because now I got to think in-kind costs too. And in particular, how social work, and I'm sure sports performance, sports psychology has been instrumental in providing in-kind sort of services. Aaron, you ready?
I'm ready. Thank you very much, Emmett, and thank you all for setting that stage, because it is all of these things, right? It's the control over their lives that the athletes often don't feel, right? And that comes from a system that doesn't prioritize their voices, right? And you know, so for me, the money is a huge issue, of course, but it's also about a culture change that has to happen. And Abigail rightly said, things have changed in many ways in the last few decades, and yet it still is the case that many college athletes, especially at the Division I level, feel enormous pressure to perform, to maintain their scholarships, to stay in school, to you know, do what their coach expects of them. And you know, before I even go into some of the details of how that creates pressure for many of these athletes, it's also really important to say this is not just an issue for college athletes; it's college students generally. You know, I teach undergraduates and graduate students at several universities, and we meditate at the beginning of every class, and the students tell me, you know, just how it's the only downtime they have, you know, 5-10 minutes for them to just take a break from their jobs, from their, you know, their family commitments, from their school. And so our young people are really struggling right now generally, and athletes face particular issues. They have unique circumstances because they are not technically employed by the university, but they are still, you know, trying to maintain their scholarships and and be part of a team in many cases, and do the things that the coaches want them to do. So, you know, the pressures are enormous. At one school that I teach at, which is Division I, a football player, you know, tells me that his coaches routinely say that his generation is soft. I mean, these kinds of comments that coaches make to players can be significantly damaging to them. And you know, let's be frank, we know that coaches are paid to win, right? Not to help players grow per se, not to help them achieve mental health. And so some coaches may certainly care about those things. And I was fortunate to follow one for my recent book about women's college basketball, she was certainly that kind of coach. But part of that is because the institution supported her in her approach to having balance between athletics and education. So I think it's really important to think about, you know, this culture that we live in, which prioritizes athletic performance above all, prioritizes winning above all, And as I've written in many places, we have to recenter education and mental health as the main priorities of this ecosystem.
And Aaron, you said that really nicely, and I appreciate that. But one of the things that also came to mind when I think about money is, the coaches who we find out are abusive coaches
Yes.
who are not, I think about, unfortunately, a situation like a Mike Rice, for example, because the litigation cost, the buyout cost, any for cause, not for cause, all of that money comes out of the athletic department. So there's sort of another cost associated with that. And, unfortunately, we've seen this issue of mental health and its intersection with coaches and other aspects of athletics, sort of, I don't think it's been on center stage, but what happened at Ole Miss, with the student athlete there who is bringing litigation against the athletic department. So those issues are definitely prevalent. I wanted to share a little bit on bipolar disorder, but I want to see
Emmett, can I jump in real quick while we're on that topic?
yes,
I
sir.
think one of the things that Aaron pointed out, and I think it connects really well to what you're talking about, the cost around how having to clean up after a bad coach. And a lot of times what we do instead is we continue this false narrative about, the specialness of athletes that they can take certain kinds of, I think the way we talk about it now is hard coaching, right? And if you can't take the hard coaching, then you don't belong in sports. And I think a lot of times, instead of investing in coach certification, or instead of investing in cleaning up an athletic department, we will tell ourselves these fairy tales about what athletes can and cannot take. And then we end up in a situation where, like Aaron talks about, athletes are, and other students as well, end up, thinking they only have this 5 minutes worth of downtime in their entire day, right? And there's an opportunity to invest, and I think that's the cost that's at the foundation of this discussion. We put things off and put things off and put things off, and things build, and now we got to pay for them somehow, right? And I think that's a really interesting connection.
Dr. Gill, Bruce sparked something there, and I just have to chime in. As someone who spent a lot of time in the coaching profession, something that I think should happen from the mental health and mental performance industry is to go to and through the coach. And I know that this has been talked about at national conferences, and the opposite has been said to what I'm saying. And as a coach, we have the power. We have we can make or break and shape an athlete's experience. And the professionals that some professionals that I've been around before would rather go through the athletes only. And I'm not saying you don't go through the athletes. I'm saying the environment and culture and the people that are the environmental engineers, the coaches need to be educated and held accountable to how athletes are being treated. So we should be thinking about how do we win kids with sport as opposed to winning sport with kids. And if we can do that, then I think we'll have a much more powerful impact because we're affecting the people that actually shape that experience.
Hey, Pat, that really resonated with me. And it reminds me of something a professor told me once. He said, as educators, we don't teach content, we teach students. And I want to be able to tell coaches, you don't coach a sport, you coach athletes. Right? I think that's a really important thing. And investing, part of being aware of mental health issues is investing in coaches understanding that thing.
Yeah, I definitely, and I'm not sure if I'm on mute. I'm wondering what Abigail's thinking about this. I'm wondering. I see her percolating over there because Pat, I'll say this. I agree with you in terms of mental health and going through coaches. They've got to be brought up to speed in terms of mental health literacy. with our app, I say it's all about the coaches. Like if we don't have the coaches on board, you might be wasting your money unless you have a mental health subcommittee or unless you've got some other things. But the coach is on board. Now, how far the coach is on board with mental health as a clinician, there's certain ethics and boundaries, and I hear you're not talking about that. But I do hear if we got coaches on board, we could be more efficient with what we do with our dollars, with the intersection between performance and mental health. I definitely see that. I definitely agree. I think coaches are the key. But I think, it just goes back to what Aaron was saying. Like, at the end of the day, this is winning games and it's a business. And I wonder how much it would cost us to help coaches see that connection between positive mental health and positive performance. And I think that's why I like the work that you do, because it's all in one unit. So it could be seen as working together.
Well, I mean, and that speaks to exactly how we've handled things at Michigan. I mean, even though I'm no longer in athletics, like that doesn't mean that I'm not contracted and still doing work with a lot of these wonderful young athletes. And I think more specifically, what speaks to what you're talking about right now is I walked into Coach Harbaugh's office 2 weeks ago and he was like, "Are you back?" And I was like, "Well, Coach, I'm still teaching, I'm still doing all these things." And he said, "Abigail, you did great work." And my response was, "Coach, we did great work, because without him involved in the process, I wouldn't have been able to work with our athletes to get the outcomes that they desired and that we ultimately all desired." I mean, it truly does take a village. And I think the stronger our relationships are with our coaches, the more we can support our coaches. Yes, the better outcomes we're going to see in our athletes. But it really does take all of us. It's not just going to be, supporting the coaches or supporting the athletes. It's looking at people that are making decisions throughout the department that ultimately can invest in mental health support and services, can work on education and support for our coaching staff. So it's everything in between. I really do think we can't just kind of target one area in space. We've got to take a much more holistic approach to providing services that are going to produce better outcomes, and I wholeheartedly believe that. So I think it really takes a village.
Yeah. Thank you for that.
Can I jump in there, Emma, just real briefly? I 100% agree. Coaches are an essential part of this system. They're the connective tissue between the athletes and the institution. But I do think also the institution and particularly officials outside the athletic department have to really step up and make it clear that there's a balance between these things, between athletics and academics. Because when it becomes the case that athletics overwhelms academics, that's when you start to see the big problems, right? That's when you start to see athletes question their value to the university if they're not performing on the sports field. And we all know in these games that we call sports, right, there's usually one winner and one loser. And so that's a really damaging place to be. And we want to be encouraging growth, which can happen on the athletic field, on the court, and in the classroom. But that's really what universities should be about. And the officials, I think, are kind of getting off the hook a little bit here. We're talking about university presidents. They need to be more courageous when they, hold coaches' feet to the fire about this balance between the two.
I'd like to, and I really love this sort of the way that we are looking at different areas in which we have interest and or experts. And I want to share a little bit more information. And please excuse me for my screen. Just know that I'm working hard on a lot of documents, and this isn't customary for a webinar, but I'm going to talk my way through this so that I can get to this screen. And I just wanted to really quickly show you. We've got a couple of clinicians on the call here, Abigail and I. So when we talk about bipolar disorders and we talk about the cost of treating bipolar disorders, and this only scratches the surface, but we really were unable to find any studies with the prevalence of bipolar disorders amongst college student athletes. So we used college students. And we said that, if we've got 500 student athletes and 3% of those athletes experience bipolar disorders, and personally, I believe that that's a lowball estimate, because we do see bipolar as a prevalent disorder amongst the athletes. But we're talking about 15,000 student athletes. And based on some of the costs that we developed, it would cost about $595 million to treat that number of athletes. Some of the costs include potential inpatient stays at $1,200 per day. Average length of stay over 9 days. So that could be at a cost of $10,000, almost $11,000. We talk about medications, whether it's mood stabilizers, antipsychotics. When we talk about the cost of medication per month, it could be almost $2,500, and over a year, almost $30,000. And if you think about that over 4 years, we're talking about over $100,000. So when we began, and we've only begun to estimate some of these costs of treating a bipolar disorder with one inpatient stay, medication, excluding therapy, we're talking about $40,000 per athlete. And again, 3%, I think that's lowballing in college athletics. And it's really not taking into account um, initial psychiatric visits for diagnosis, ongoing medical management and psychiatric visits, therapy, lost tuition, again, lost games. When I think about some of these things, just in terms of bringing more attention to mental health and college sports, all of these things that we've talked about today, they come at a cost to our athletes, and it really costs to treat them. And again, whether you've got 5 clinicians like Patty, whether you have 8 like Abigail had or more, it's still a challenge to work with all of these athletes. So I don't know if our panel might have any responses to that, or if there are other themes that you want to talk about with regard to cost now.
I guess I'll respond to one of the questions that came up in the chat, Emmett, that was specific to cost. Because one of the attendees had brought up that their D1 colleges whose budgets don't have any resources or funding. Actually, it says that they're not allowed to have dedicated mental health professionals in athletics and only depend on the counseling center. And so obviously that gets into like policy and practices that if we're not allocating funding for mental health, then that's a whole nother issue, right? Because when we look at NCAA policies, it clearly states there's a responsibility of the institution and the athletic department to provide and have mental health services accessible. And that goes beyond just access to counseling. This is a little bit about what Pat was talking about earlier, right? So we've got to consider educational materials. We've got to consider things like apps, like Emmett, you developed Athlete Talk. So just different ways of providing support to our student athletes becomes really critical. And I think we have to think outside the box of just like counseling. Now, is counseling critical and essential? Yeah, we just saw that based off of the data that you showed. If we look back at the NCAA data from 2021 to look at, 24% of males, and I think it's 36% of females reported that they were experiencing a depressed state to the point where it was impairing their functioning. I mean, this is a large percentage of student athletes that we're looking at across the country that require support and services. And I firmly believe that everyone should have access to those services in a way that's culturally responsive. And that gets to one of the other questions that was brought up is what is culturally responsive care and how can we ensure that we're providing that? As a practitioner that carries multiple identities, it's been critical for me to take a step back and see how can I be culturally responsive in the service delivery I'm providing to our student athletes, and when do I need to refer out, right? And I think being humble enough to say, like, I've got additional resources can be really critical to that. But at the same time, I think sometimes people are getting really rigid with what people need within collegiate sport, and it's holding us back from achieving better outcomes for our student athletes and the entire system. So I think we've got to go through another door.
Yeah. I really like the question about non-Western techniques, and are those available? Because, again, I hate to beat I don't want to beat anything. I don't want to beat any dead horse or anything. So I'm sorry, but that stuff comes at a cost to find those people. Sometimes those people are out of state. Sometimes those people are oftentimes the best of the best, so they might come at a higher hourly rate. All of those things are really important. And I want to make sure that we're addressing all the questions here. Thank you for doing that, Abigail. I appreciate it. Just in terms of prevalence of mental health disorders, I asked this earlier, and I put this in the email to our panelists, but just in terms of what you're hearing, anything in terms of what our college athletes in terms of mental health are facing more than others in terms of prevalence?
Well, I mean, I think the studies are going to show us different things, right? One in particular that I look at is just eating disorders in particular, and the length of time at which someone's in an active state of their disorder, and how that impacts performance and just overall functioning, I think is something that I have seen come up quite a lot. I also look at that being really the highest external referral source amongst providers across the country. And because it really does require a multidisciplinary team approach, higher levels of care in some situations, whether it's intensive outpatient, a PIHP program, or even inpatient program. So, you know, I think we can look at different research or studies, as many people on the call know, are going to tell us all different things. But eating disorders is where I've seen a significant difference in the level of care that's been required for our athletes.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that, Abigail, because I think when we were doing estimates, we did also examine eating disorders, and just in terms of some of the line items that are required when you're treating an eating disorder. I mean, like you said, we looked at first of all, disorder eating testing, $1,000, hospitalization, intensive outpatient treatment, residential treatment, like you mentioned, psychologist for therapy or medication monitoring, medications, depending on the type of disorder. I mean, and like you said, the need for a multidisciplinary team. So that definitely makes it tough. Any other disorders, in particular, if we're talking about, and there may not be some of these costs, because one of the things that I struggled with is also looking at some of the unfortunate costs of mental health. For example, if we think about it, there's also a tangible cost when one of our student athletes decides to take their life by suicide. There's also a cost there. Not just the cost to the family, not just the cost to just loss of life, but there are other costs to the university, unfortunately. Just any direct or indirect things that you think about when you think about mental health and things that we need to consider.
Yeah, I would add to what Abigail said there as well, with respect to eating disorders and other kind of issues that may or may not be related to body image issues. What we're seeing with undergraduates these days is obviously similar to the rest of society, but maybe even to a greater extent, the use of social media. And one of the things that I think is really important to talk about in this context is the fact that the NCAA has kind of kicked the can down the road on providing more funding for athletes directly from university coffers by allowing for athletes to monetize their names, images, and likenesses. And that's obviously a step in the right direction. They should have never had that right abrogated in the first place. However, it is, I think, problematic and probably for female athletes, perhaps to a larger degree than male athletes, that if they're selling their names, images, and likenesses in the public marketplace, that can lead to a lot of body image issues. And so I think that we have to make connections between what's happening culturally, what's happening legally. There are cases coming down the pike in terms of trying to get universities to support athletes more financially. But as long as athletes are attempting to sell their names, images, and likenesses in the marketplace, that could potentially lead to new problems, new mental health issues, and also exacerbate existing ones.
I was just taking a look at a couple of the questions here. It says from a
Hey,
non-mental
Emmett,
health
can
professional.
we go back a little bit before we get to the
Yeah,
next question?
yeah,
I
absolutely.
think the discussion around eating disorders um, has makes me think as well about the cost of other kinds of staff or professionals in athletic departments, and I'm thinking about nutritionists, and I'm also thinking about um, the strength and conditioning coaches. And one of the things that we recognize with strength and conditioning coaches, for example, is that they're often seen as clinicians who aren't clinicians, right? They're kind of the culture builders on a lot of different teams, especially if you're talking about football. And they're the people that coaches trust to go to athletes and talk about the things that are bothering them. I think that's a thing that is a necessary part of the discussion. And I know we all know on this call that when we talk about eating disorders, we're not talking about folks' understanding of nutrition, right? We're talking about deep body image issues and other things. But I think those who are uninitiated, who may not have that mental health awareness that we want them to, think first about, well, how can I help this athlete eat better, right? And we start spending money on things like nutritionists and what have you. I think there's some connection there. I just wanted to bring that piece up.
Oh no, Bruce, I appreciate that. And I, I've just, when I was at the University of Texas, I learned so much about disordered eating from Ashley Harmon, who leads the clinical services effort there. And I think, Bruce, what you said around strength and conditioning and what Pat has said around coaches is really the basis for this comment. I'm wondering when mental health would become a part of coaches' contracts, strength and conditioning coaches' contracts, mental health professionals' contracts, where, there's some measure, even if it's just investment in time. It doesn't have to be outcomes. Just saying that, what, we're going to invest this time in our athletes as well as our staff's mental health. And, not opposed to, there's bonus for that. There's a bonus for APR rates. There's a bonus for GSR rates and all of those things. And I think maybe they said something is in Deion's contract around student athlete development. But I think because strength and conditioning coaches are so important, because nutritionists are so important, and just assistant coaches and the systems that staffs set up to help their student athletes with mental health and development are so important that it should be a part of their contracts. And if we have to incentivize it, then we have to incentivize it through finances.
I think those are all really good points. And Abigail mentioned this earlier, the interdisciplinary team. When you can have all of the professionals that you need to provide services all in the room, working together, communicating together, providing care, that's when things really go to the next level. Because the athlete needs all of that. We also have to talk about the injured athlete and mental health. And then you're talking about the team physician and the sports medicine and the physical therapist. Well, then the strength and conditioning coach wants to know where that athlete is in that process. Then the nutritionist, the dietitian wants to know how they should be fueling and are they eating right. So all of these areas have grown over the years, which is good. Coaches also have to learn to integrate with these areas and make them just as much as your offensive coordinator, defensive coordinator, who's your mental health coordinator, your strength and conditioning coordinator. Like these people in these positions have to gain more prominent roles. And I can't think of a better way to make something more important than to incentivize it with a bonus.
Well, I'll say this as a former academic support professional, I'm still waiting on my bonus for when my athletes did really, really well in school.
Yeah.
And I might still be in that business if they were able to incentivize us that way.
Yeah, no, David Ripath has your money. I know he does. I know he's got your money. I think this is a great
I'm gonna
question
talk to
here.
David tomorrow, and I'm gonna tell him you said that.
Talk to him. David's got big money. There are a couple of questions that I think are really good ones. One, one talked about mental health and the role of the transfer portal and what role the transfer portal is playing in mental health in any capacity. I hope I got it right because the question sort of disappeared. All of this technology here is stifling to me. And then there's another question that Jerry poses that talks about, is there a best practice model that departments can use to follow the appropriate level of mental health support? It could provide a way for third-party experts or an association to structure the support services, the support, and validate costs. Love for our panelists to provide any feedback or answer either one of those questions.
I'll take a bit of the transfer portal question, if I may. One of the things that I think is really important to remember about the transfer portal is that it, to some degree, creates a better balance of power between athletes and coaches. And historically speaking, up until the age of NIL, athletes were not in a position of relative power to coaches. And so with that in mind, athletes being able to transfer between one institution and another if the coach is abusive or if the institution isn't providing what the player was promised, I think that's a step in the right direction to balance the power. Because remember, coaches in many cases are being paid enormous salaries, right? Which gives them a sense of entitlement, and athletes are not being paid salaries at all. And so I think we have to think about that balance of power when we think about the transfer portal.
I'll share something that I heard from a colleague of mine that's deeply disturbing around the transfer portal and mental health. The coaches on this particular team was denying access to mental health, or was making it very difficult for the mental health professional to have access to the team because the current players could use mental health as an excuse to transfer. I don't know if you've heard that, but that's deeply disturbing. That is that could be happening.
But not surprising, right? I mean, and that's what I mean. I just, connection, positive mental health, wellness, the athlete who can perform. I just sometimes don't understand folks who don't get that bridge. But other transfer portal or models, and with regard to models in that question, Jerry, from my perspective, it's like right now we had the Abigail, Pat, I'm sorry, we had the haves. Right? We had the haves, the 4-star mental health models. Yeah, Pat, you're in that category now. And now we 5-star. 5-star. I'm sorry. You can tell where I stay. When I travel, you can tell where I stay. You got the 5-star, and now you've got others coming along, like my alma mater, UNC Charlotte, mid-major, AAC. But right now they've got 4 practitioners in mental health. And so you see other programs coming along. UNC Asheville. I'm a North Carolina guy, so they have a practitioner there. And then you see folks who've got a couple. The University of Texas. Then you see some that have 3 and 4 and 5. But best practices, I don't think we put them together yet because all of our situations are probably so unique. I don't know. It's like you've really got to figure it out. Maybe I do have a healthcare center that I'm going to work with. Maybe I don't. Maybe I've got an AD who has an MSW. Maybe I don't. Could y'all speak to sort of the model that how you feel they're coming along in college athletics and mental health?
So even though I, raise my hand and say we're a 5-star program, that doesn't mean our program's perfect. And I'm humble enough to say that. I think when we look at the data that exists across the country, and more specifically, like to certain conferences, what we're recognizing as the best practice model is really a medical integrated care model, right? So when we look at just the Big Ten alone, a little over 60% of the Big Ten has integrated a medical integrated care model. We've seen that to be extremely effective. Then we've also seen like staged care, stepped care models to determine the level of services that can be provided. That I think also what we've noticed keeps costs down a little bit more and is still an effective way of delivering care. A lot of that's going to be done from how often and how early you're screening your student athletes and their mental health and wellness needs. So, you know, I think a lot of times when people look at screening resources, people are not doing a great job screening our student athletes from the very beginning, right? We need a much more comprehensive, I believe, screening tool from the very beginning so we can determine how many student athletes are maybe going to need care from the very beginning. How many folks can we then anticipate that might need care along the way as things change? I mean, a number of institutions, we have athletes that have never left their home state before, and they're coming to a new state, new place, and to think that there's not going to be some sort of adjustment and impact on mental health, I think that's just absent-minded, right? We've got folks that are coming from other countries. There's a lot of ways I think that we can engage and look at best practice models when we're working with various populations. It's not going to be a one size fits all, but it is going to be a way of blending models together to determine what's best for your individual institution. And we've created different assessments and evaluations in order to help determine that. So those are things that I'm always happy to share. I saw that there was also a question in the chat about Coaches Connected and core elements of this program. So first and foremost, we train every single one of our coaches and all of our frontline staff on Mental Health 101, which also includes QPR, question, persuade, refer. So every single one of our coaches and frontline staff is offered and presented with these opportunities to learn how to intervene when someone is presenting with suicide or suicidal ideation, whether with plan or intent, and how do you access resources from that. Other things that we cover in Coaches Connected are mental skills. So mental skills training, how do we work with our student athletes? How do you embed that into your coaching? We also talk about things like restorative care and managing stress as a coach, which has been important. I think we talk a lot about self-care, which is great. But unless we're doing things to actually restore our mental health and wellness, we're only going to get so far. We also talk about inspiring trust, promoting buy-in and healthy team dynamics during the off season, because this isn't just when we're in season, it counts. It's all the time. And I think the other thing that I really appreciated that we've been able to meet with our coaches about is teaching them about Gen Z athletes. What does it mean to work with a Gen Z and coach a Gen Z athlete? And really shout out to Chelsea Day, who was the original developer of that piece. But and Cassie, I think Cassie's on here too. Cassie's done those presentations as well. So really making good use of what's needed and how can we be more preventative with our coaching through education.
I mean, can I talk about a model? Also, I was viewing a webinar, I think that you were one of the participants of last winter, where I can't remember what school it was, but I think there was a basketball program in Philadelphia where the coaches actually modeled good mental health hygiene for their athletes. And a couple of things that they did, for example, were have mental health focused meetings amongst themselves as coaches, and the athletes knew about it. If they also would be open about their mental health challenges with their athletes. They would also be open about appointments that they might have with clinicians, with their athletes. And part of what they wanted to do was to normalize the like I said before, the hygiene that it takes to have good mental health. I think that's a really interesting model. And I would love to see more coaches be open about the anxiety that they feel, because they must face a lot of anxiety to win, right? They must feel a lot of pressure to win. And I would love to see more coaches be more open about what that is and what that feels like and how they manage it.
And so the title of this session is the cost, right, of mental health. And I think something we need to look at is our athletics departments, no matter if you're D3, 2, 1, we're set up to generate revenue. We're set up as a business. And what we may need to do is look at our business office, but also our development office. So if you're at a smaller school, development offices may be on campus. But we already have models in place where orthopedic surgeons are usually not employed by the athletics department. Team physicians are usually not employed by the athletics department. Dentists are usually not employed by the athletics department, but they're always around. And a lot of them are providing services and are getting returns or trade for their services. So they may be investing their time, but they're getting compensated with tickets or there's something that they're getting in exchange for that. So what we just need to do is make sure that mental health people are seen in that same light of being important, just like an orthopedic surgeon. Yes, if you blow out your ACL, yes, you need an orthopedic surgeon. You also need a mental health specialist, therapist there to help you get through that situation as well. And I think that's where we have to continue to learn how an athletics department works and help those people in that department understand what the needs are. For instance, I have a development person whose office is right next to mine, and we have regular conversations. And there's people in the community that want to help, and they want to give their time, they want to give their resources. And so you have to have people in the development office that are ready and equipped with the information that they can engage those people and say, okay, for your $10,000 donation, here's what you get in return. And that's how we can continue to build this as to offset the cost.
And really quickly, Pat, because there's some questions and I'm not sure how much time we got. So Rebecca, please help us out. But you hit on a couple of things. First of all, the development folks, I've been trying to bring them into the fold of mental health, right? Especially at the D3 level. I think that's one of the D2 and D3 strengths is that they do have strong alumni, like you said, alumni that want to help. But I think it goes to sort of Abigail's point around best practices. It's like, I think that what I want our audience to realize is that although this mental health thing is a great idea and it has positive outcomes and all of that, it's hard to we're at a point where we're still working this into athletics where people feel comfortable enough about it. So that when we have things like non-Western medicine and spirituality, we're like, okay, yeah, we get it, we understand it, but we're working in this athletic department that's always on ESPN that, we're working in that space. The last thing that Pat mentioned is just really important. I'm glad he threw me this softball, is that we have not talked about the connection between injury and mental health, which is huge. Just in terms of getting people back on the field, just in terms of making sure that they are prepared to get back in the classroom and on the field. We know that some of our tragedies a couple of springs ago were related to injury in terms of student athletes taking their lives. That piece, and I was so blessed working under Alan Harden at the University of Texas, where he prioritized a group for injured athletes. And it came at a cost, even when we talked about the snacks. I mean, y'all don't know how many Tiff's treats it takes to get through a whole season with injured athletes. That's a big expenditure there. So Pat, I appreciate you throwing me that softball, and I'm going to be quiet because I know that we probably only got a few minutes left. So I'll yield the floor right now.
I mean, I think this speaks to, Emmett, what you and Pat were both talking about. Like, a lot of the work that we've done is not possible without our donors. Absolutely not possible without our donors. Their influence and commitment to our institution and our athletes' wellness has been, I think, essential to actually, it's like the piece of the puzzle that if we don't have it, it's not going to move. And so to really speak to our donors in a way that says, like, this is how we're utilizing your money and this is the impact that it's having on people, I think has been a real important point for many of us. I'm looking at some of the questions in the chat and wondering about this one where it says, like, how could D3 programs traditionally under-resourced be charged with mental health initiatives instead of relying on university counseling centers? So this like creative programming such as team bonding, downtime, is that enough? Volunteer guest presenters. I mean, I think whatever you can do, Christine, to increase awareness and understanding is going to be really important to your programs. I think the other thing too is that, you know, even when we look at bringing in guest speakers, and I had mentioned this before, you know, if we bring in guest speakers, let's say once a semester or a quarter, it's going to have an impact, but that impact is short term. And so can we put in things like a wellness group where folks are coming in once a week, supporting student athletes and skill building? You know, that's a very small piece of a budget. You know, that may only cost people about $15,000 per year, and in some areas a little bit less. So it's giving people that bridge and the skills in order to, you know, help work towards wellness, while ultimately there's going to be some folks that meet the threshold and need more counseling services, whether it be, you know, severe and persistent mental illnesses that Emmett talked about earlier, or folks that are, you know, responding to a traumatic experience. So I think we've got to look at, yes, we can take advantage of having, you know, folks come in and give free talks and engaging in team bonding. That also costs money. So it's like, where do you want to put your money, I think is critical here. But I do think there's an opportunity for D3 programs to get really creative of how they respond to student athlete mental health needs. And I'm happy to talk about it, Christine, afterwards, if that would be helpful.
Emma, can I jump in here if I may? I just want to say one more thing about what you mentioned in terms of injuries. You know, part of what I think is happening when an athlete gets injured is there's a loss of athletic identity. And when we think about college sports, because college athletes are admitted to universities often as special admissions, at many universities where there isn't the balance between academics and athletics, and that balance is not institutionalized, right? It's not, coaches are not told you need to be in charge of both winning games and developing student athletes to the best of their ability as people. When that balance is not there, that identity becomes stronger. And I think it's really important to remember that, you know, in the United States, people tend to conflate themselves with their roles to begin with, right? It's not the case in other countries, right? I've done a lot of research in Japan. People are not conflating those two things all the time. They look at themselves and their identities one way, but the role that they perform is seen as something else. And so when we conflate ourselves and our role in that way, it can lead to a really strong identity as athletes. And that can be problematic when you get injured. It can also be problematic when your career ends as an athlete. And so I think we have to keep that in mind as well.
Great points. Pat, I don't know. I think you hit on some of this, but there was a question about your unit and how. Yeah, I know. Hold on a second. It's about funding and how you got your effort at
I answered
Louisville
it.
funded.
I answered it, but I can answer
Okay.
it. I typed an answer, but I can answer it now. So good friend of mine, Abigail Eiler, she's right here. I call her a good friend because she really helped us develop a roadmap on what we wanted to be able to do. So I was able to spend some time, go up to Michigan and spend some time with her and understand how to best organize or design something that would be best for our needs. Of course, it takes funds and it takes funding. We knew that we were working on renegotiating the contract with the current healthcare provider, the current hospital system, and we opened it up. We put out an RFP, so a request for proposal, and we had the university hospital responded to that proposal. In the contract, we included mental health services along with orthopedic and team physician and sports science. So it wasn't just mental health. So the university hospital, they stepped up and they said that they would provide that for us. So most of our staff are university hospital employees, including our director of sports science. but those positions report up through my position in athletics, along with our director of mental health and performance, Kate O'Brien. So she's the only athletics department staff that's hired by the athletics department, but all of those professionals report up through her and her staff. And that's how we're able to do it. So when we had even the professor position, we had the conversation with the dean of the College of Education. That person, so Dr. Andreas Stamatis, his number one priority is to create a coach education certificate program, not just for our coaches, but for all coaches. And that is going to be something that is going to generate revenue for the Department of Education in our HSS department. So it's developing those relationships with people, understanding what they may want to get out of it. And obviously the hospital system wants the fact that they're taking care of our athletes, and that helps them with the community. So knowing that we created these win-wins with people, and that became part of a bigger partnership, I think that's how we were able to get it done. I mean, if we were depending on just funds coming from the athletics department, we don't quite have our donor base engaged like Abigail had at Michigan, but that's something that we're working on.
Yeah, and I think that part of that goes to, again, and just not to underestimate the cost. It's sort of like to change the culture of mental health in your athletic department. There's this literacy piece that has to happen with development, with the coaches, with the staff, with the athletes, with the parents. And again, that costs money. I know one of the things that we would do at Texas is we utilize videos. We develop videos, posters, even the events. Those things come at a cost. I think that, have we caught up on all the questions here? I just want to make sure. I think we have, and I think we're going down.
There's a question in the Q&A about institutional response to bad behavior from coaches that can impact athlete mental health and athletes choosing to leave the institution. Have we connected on that one just yet? And I think there's a way to talk about that in terms of cost as well. And I think one of the reasons why institutions choose not to get rid of coaches, even after some number of reports of bad behavior, is because of the cost. It costs them more to send a coach packing than it does to see an athlete transfer or leave their sport. I think admitting that up front is a really important place to start when we have a conversation like this.
Yes, and because athletes haven't been paid all these years, the coaching salaries have been able to rise to such levels where that would be the case.
It's just and I'm gonna just be honest, and I'm not high level like Abigail and Pat and the rest of y'all. I'm not high level like that, but I'm like, some of this stuff that comes out on these coaches, it's like risk management, right? I would think that you would go ahead and let that person go and raise that money or do whatever to get that person away from these kids. I mean, I think about some of the instances where the whole softball team had written a letter to the AD and had sat down with the coach. It's like, are they making that much money that that's just tough for me to fathom. Especially for those of us who are parents.
Right, with Northwestern football. And the report came out, and the institution investigated, and they decided on some slap on the wrist. And they weren't moved to do anything more serious until the public raised a cry, right? And I think, to me, and I don't know, right? I'm definitely not involved in that situation or others, but it seems to me like one motivation for the institution to not fire a coach in that point is not just having to pay the rest of the coaches contract out, and the difficulty around firing someone for cause, but then you get lawsuits, and you got to pay your lawyers, and then maybe you lose a lawsuit, then you got to pay that, right? And I think sometimes, well, I think two things. One, the institution might see it as easier just to keep that coach, but you're also having to pay pay a cost on in terms of the mental health of your athletes who are having to deal with that coach day after day after day, year after year after year, decade after decade in some cases.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I hear you on that point.
It's interesting because I think we can say like, yes, this is on the coach and things of that nature, but I also think there's a responsibility and call to action for administrators. I mean, we, as someone who was a former administrator, the things that I had to consider was, what are those end of the year evaluations, but also why are we waiting till people are seniors and fifth years and exiting the program to evaluate their student athlete experience? We really should be looking at it. What are things like preseason, during season, postseason, so that we can be more engaging and preventative instead of having to be so instead of being so reactive. I think, when we let things go on for extended periods of time, there's harm done. And so I think as a former administrator, I think it's critical to say, I've got a responsibility in this. I've got a responsibility to be able to step in when things come up, as opposed to ignore it and keep going forward.
I have to add to that. That's awesome, Abigail. At my previous institution, University of Missouri, we had Dr. Rick McGuire, and he helped to establish a master's program in positive coaching at the university. But he also established the Institute for Positive Coaching to go around and help other schools, other leaders in sport, to become a positive coaching school. We put up 3 large banners in our facilities, and one was in the weight room, right in the center of the weight room above the mirrors. We are a positive coaching school, and it outlined how athletes should be treated in that environment. When you walk into the indoor, right there, you walk down the first flight of steps, there's a big sign, and then once you go into the indoor practice facility, on the equipment cage, another sign: we are a positive coaching school. Well, when your athletes see that, then there's some sort of accountability that has to come along with that. And the athletics director has to be the one that signs off on it and says, these are the behaviors that are acceptable or not acceptable if you're going to work for me in this athletics department. And of course, that's where it starts, in the athletics department. And it can be carried out all throughout the athletics department. And if you put that out there in front of your athletes to say, this is what we're about, this is how coaches should treat athletes, this is how, it's okay to be demanding, but we're not demeaning. That was also on the poster. We're demanding, not demeaning. So, coach, you can be as demanding as you want to be, but we're never going to cross the line into being disrespectful or demeaning. And you put that out there, and then, of course, no one gets it perfect. You don't get it right every day, but it creates the opportunity for that level of accountability to say, this is what we're about.
Yeah, and I really think that speaks to some of the things that Aaron was talking about in terms of, now that we have NIL, now that we have some of these athletes' right issues, now you really have to pay attention to the way that you're treating these young men and these young women. I think that is so important. Really, just quickly, there was a question, how much, I think they said, oh yeah, Nancy asked if an academic advisor got a bonus on good academic work, what should it be? Nancy, I think 20%, you always tip 20%. So possibly 20% on their salary. I don't know how Bruce feels about that. There was also another question. I love this one. I'd love to hear the panel's perspective about athletic departments, often lesser funded departments, professionals who are both licensed, I'm assuming in mental health, and CMPC certified, such that an individual is serving both roles, a mental health provider and a performance enhancement specialist. Sounds like a budget cutting measure there. I have no comment. Anybody want to comment on the licensure and the CMPC designation?
I am happy to comment on that. I think when we look at best practices, whether it be from the NCAA or just across the field, it is ensuring that you're working with a licensed professional, regardless of discipline, right? So we can talk about psychologists, we can talk about clinical social workers like myself, LPCs, the list goes on and on and on. I think that CMPC distinction raises the bar in terms of people's training and ability to be able to help support on the performance side of things. But first and foremost, a licensed mental health professional is going to be instrumental to the success of our student athletes and our overall programs.
Yeah, and the CMPC does raise the bar. I think that part of the reality is that we have to realize in athletics, we have to get in where we can fit in. And that CMPC allows a lot of people to fit in this space, and it provides an entree for them to do the mental health work. So yeah, that's really important. We got 5 minutes left, so we can, I think whether we've answered all the questions, I will check, but did anyone have sort of anyone to make closing comments or any thoughts?
I'll say something briefly. I think that there's a lot of talk publicly, and rightfully so, about exploitation. And in college sports, there is exploitation. And largely that exploitation is the result of not taking care of athletes' educational opportunities, their growth opportunities, and their mental health. And so I think it's really important that we remember that this can be a great opportunity for young people to grow athletically, but also to grow academically and spiritually and socially and so forth. And so I think it's really important that we reconnect to what higher education's core values ought to be, which is having that balance between education and athletics without allowing these pressures to develop because of this performance-based model, which we currently see, particularly at the D1 level. That creates enormous pressure on young people, and you couple that with all the other pressures that exist in their lives, and it's a powder keg. So thank you all for allowing me to be here.
Thank you for that. Anybody else?
I'll speak really quickly. One of the recurring themes in my discussions in this space is about how we do not allow athletes to fail or to learn from failure. There's a lot of pressure to succeed, and when they don't succeed, they're often pushed off the island, so to speak. I think creating an environment where failure, I mean, sports is a place where, like I think someone said it earlier, there are winners and losers, and oftentimes folks lose. And helping folks understand how to learn from that kind of failure, and also other failures that they might experience in life, is really important. And perhaps investing in that sort of education or coaching could prevent the need to invest in other models as well.
I'll just close and say I'm a big proponent of providing and teaching the skills of focus, resilience to the athletes, coaches, anyone supporting the student athlete. I think that if you can teach these skills and they can draw on these skills, it can actually help us with our mental health, our coaches' mental health, our staff's mental health, our student athletes' mental health, by having more skills.
Good. All right. Well, I forgot how we usually end these Drake group webinars, so I'm just gonna say, I really appreciate it. I can't wait to review this and to look at this webinar, to go more in detail in terms of how, I'm sort of thinking about expenditures. I'm looking forward to hopefully working with the Drake group on expanding this look at the cost of mental health in college sports. I think we've hit on so many different things, and we didn't even have a chance to talk about sort of how the things that we do contribute to positively to mental health, right? That developmental, what is the cost of positive? What are the benefits of the positive costs, the positive aspects of coaching? We didn't have an opportunity to look at those. But I think we're just scratching the surface in terms of mental health. As everyone was thinking, I was sort of thinking about, how much it was Aaron's comment about getting back to higher ed. Aaron, because when I picture NIL, I always picture NIL like you went to class to learn about the communications, you went to class to learn about budgets. You didn't have all of these companies coming in and doing this work, but now we do. And I wonder, if we could do that for mental health, like Pat was saying, involve more of the community in the mental health of our college athletes and different modes of medicine and all of those types of things. But we just scratched the surface here. I want to thank everybody for their time today. I really appreciate it. Every time I call and beg y'all to do something for me, you're always there. So I appreciate it. And we're just gonna sign off unless Rebecca's gonna get back on the line and tell us about some things we need to do. Rebecca? Nope.
You were good to sign off.
We're good to sign off. Everybody take care.